welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, let's talk about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan. Boy, that brings back memories. I haven't talked about Reagan in a very long time, and I may have to get you all caught up on my history with Reagan. Um, Now, of course, there's a new movie out on Ronald Reagan starring Dennis Quaid. I'm hearing really good reviews on it. I have not seen it yet. I'm probably gonna wait for it to come out on streaming, and then I'll definitely be interested in watching it. As when I was a young man and first, getting involved in politics in the mid '90s, I developed a big fascination with Ronald Reagan. Um, was kind of like a hero at the time when I was a young man, when I was deep into conservative libertarian-esque type politics at the time. I mean, I've come a long way, from a sort of a classical liberal libertarian-esque kind of a guy to now I consider myself more of a Catholic integralist. But I like the Gipper. I grew up. He was my generation. I was a kid, um, and I remember being in grade school, middle school, and high school when he finally left office. I got really the full Reagan experience all throughout my grade school years, right? I graduated in 1989 from high school in Los Angeles, and Reagan left January 1989. And so it was an interesting time, to say the least. And there's many things about Reagan that I admired, that I still do admire. I mean, as an integrist that looks at things from not from a left and right paradigm anymore, but I believe in the intrinsic value of Christendom and restoring Christian order. Obviously, Reagan being in that old school classical liberal camp, obviously there's some vast differences there. But listen, I deal with America for what it is, right? Until some meaningful changes come down the pipe at some point, until we realize that we need the gospels back in America in a real and meaningful way, not this abstract religious liberty thing that we've concocted through sort of the founding Protestant mythos. And so I try and find a balance, because I will sit here and tell you what I believe is true and right and just at the same time. America is the nation we live in. It's the nation that we have to do our best to govern this place, and ultimately we have to appreciate what we have, right? Even with all of its faults, and try and find a way to live in this nation, this society, this culture as best we can, even though it seems to be becoming a darker and darker place. When it comes to a figure like Reagan, I had great admiration for him when I was in the classical liberal camp, because he really stood up for steadfast conservative principles and tough on communism. Had some more of a right wing, limited government, economic, philosophical principles that I liked at the time. Stood, at least, gave lip service to proper and just old school Christian morality. And in many ways, he was a relief from a electoral system, particularly the presidency in America, that had produced one far left president after another. And we got to a point by the late 1970s where the culture was already deteriorating and the economy was deteriorating. Foreign policy on the world front, America was having problems. And here comes, the actor Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California, obviously, and then he had his experiences down in Hollywood when he was an actor, confronting the Marxists, the communists down there. Now, guys, I haven't talked about this stuff in, oh my goodness, a couple of decades. I got to be honest with you, at least about 15 years now. And so a lot of this, I'm doing this from memory, and just what I remember. But, for Reagan, he was a product of his time. I think, especially after the World War II period, that there was this period in American history, sort of a honeymoon stage of sorts, if you want to call it that. After World War II ended, America proclaimed itself the winners of World War II, And with that, we get that what's labeled the greatest generation. It's a baby boom era. It's an era of prosperity for about 20 years after the war. And in that sense, that's the environment that Ronald Reagan was really raised in. And by the time we get to the 80s, and sort of the tentacles of liberalism have stretched out all over the place, they've begun to sort of strike down a lot of the economic prosperity, the culture through the sexual revolution starting in the 1960s is breaking down. We have more moral disorder, right? Things like Three's Company and, highlighting the shacking up out of wedlock. And we're having now more a sexually licensed culture. Feminism is just really starting to take off. The general morality is breaking down. Sex before marriage, divorces are exploding. Some elements of homosexuality are starting to take off, and really the degeneracy of the liberal West that we're now all living through. In many ways, you could trace it back to the 60s and 70s. I think you go further back than that, don't get me wrong, but I think the 60s is that seminal moment where it all comes to the forefront out on public display. I think that's the difference. Um, that's the difference, I should say. I think for Reagan, who came a generation prior to the sort of 50s and 60s generation, he was a guy that was trying to hold on to what was essentially American morality. And of course, what is American morality? Um, in the era of a young Reagan, right? The 20s, the 30s. I forgot what year exactly he was born. I think, oh boy, I don't know if he was born in the teens. He might have been born in the teens or the 20s, but America, and I think historian Charles Colomb, who I had on this podcast a while back now, said, America worked when Catholics, Protestants, and Jews all kind of believed in the same things, all kind of had sort of that general morality. And I think, in essence, that's what Reagan came from. While Protestantism is always devolving and breaking down, there were still some elements of Protestantism that were still in its early days of that devolution of sorts. And you have some orthodoxy in a kind of in a Protestant way, I guess. Obviously now that's all vanquished because that's all Protestantism ever does is just sort of, kind of break down, and you have to find new forms of Protestant sects and theologies, and they always have to reinvent the wheel in one capacity or another. But I think in America before, again, mass transit and mass communication, where the government, where the nation was more isolated, you go to your own individual homogenous community, protect the values you believed in. Reagan came from that world, right? That 1930s, 40s, and 50s kind of Americana kind of an innocence. And I think by the time we get to the 60s, then especially the 70s, where he's kind of, well, not kind of, but he is the governor of California. We have all these radical uprisings in the universities and all over the cultures. The hippies in that era of the Vietnam War are pushing alternative lifestyles already there, lots of sexual license. And here comes Reagan, who's kind of an American good old boy trying to hold on to those great innocent values that came a generation earlier. And that's what Reagan always represented. And his father was a Catholic, mother was a Protestant. I don't think he got the best example of a Catholic witness from his father, who I believe was an alcoholic. But he always had exposure to Catholics in his life. He himself was a Protestant, and that's what he practiced on his own to a certain degree. But when Reagan came to the forefront in an era where the culture was already breaking down, the Soviet Empire was expanding all over the world, and the economy was floundering by the late 70s, Reagan presented that good old boy America that was going to bring back something of the past, something that was familiar and safe. And I remember that era, being a kid. I remember when Reagan very vaguely got elected. I was in 1980. I was like 8 years old, 8 years old when he was elected, and then all through my grammar school, through middle school, we used to call it junior high school, and then high school. Um, Reagan always seemed to come off to me as a boy. Not that I followed politics at that age in any kind of way, but sort of this old, wise grandfather that always protected us, right? He talked tough. He stood up for American values. He stood up for traditional values and always had a sort of a comforting way to get across his message to those of us that still believe traditional values. Now, of course, the problem with Reagan um, is that he had kind of this libertarian streak in him in terms of governance, right? Cut taxes, confront the Soviet Union, and ultimately limited government, which is fine. Some of those principles I agree with wholeheartedly. But what we've known, and I think this is where, for a lot of the things we give Reagan credit for, right? Confronting the Soviet Union. Now, I don't know, about the whole military buildup, right? Right in the, should I say, um, using national deficits in order to build the biggest and strongest military in the world to confront the Soviet Union. And it's been told to us because our military is so big and we were willing to print so much money, that the Soviet Union realized they couldn't compete with us. So what the hell? Let's all break it down because we can't compete with the Americans. That's essentially what we were told, right? And I don't know about that. I got to be honest with you. I did like the fact that, you know, Reagan did stand up to the Soviet Union and needed to be done. I think the Soviet Union, as I've talked about on this podcast so many times before, was burdened because of the mistakes of liberal governments such as America and Britain, because we had, especially in America, very radical leftist presidents like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and you could probably throw Kennedy in there to a certain respect, and even a guy like Truman. Some people call him a moderate, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. To me, all American presidents in one capacity or another go to the left. And I think with Reagan, he was probably the leastest left of all, because he had these kind of more laissez-faire, sort of domestic principles that he held to. And so, did Reagan win the Cold War? Yeah, sure. In so much as for me that he at least confronted the problem, head on, morally, so to speak, and the Soviet Union collapsed on his watch. Did John Paul II play a role in that? Sure, absolutely. They worked together. I'll accept the narrative, though I do believe there was a divine intervention there that really probably played the biggest role rather than geopolitics. Um, at least, so that's the narrative we've always been told. But the 80s were an interesting period because it was a very colorful era. You can see that in the music and the evolution of Hollywood and movies and the technology that was developing. The music in and of itself was very poppy and uplifting. You see a vast contrast as we get into the 90s with grunge and rap music that goes very, very dark. That's the interesting thing about it. And maybe that just reflected the times and the devolution of the family, particularly as the divorce culture really starts to have an adverse effect in our youth, in our young people in the 90s. These are the offspring of that 1960s generation that were contracepting and they were engaging out of sexual license before marriage, resulting in divorces and abortions and contraception and all that stuff that we know breaks down familial cohesion. That was playing out in the 90s, and maybe that's what the music represented. And maybe the age was still the kind of last bastion of that 1940s and 30s generation that held on to these more traditional values. I can accept that. But Reagan was interesting because while he held on personally to these values, in that libertarian spirit, we as Americans don't sort of force our values upon anybody, right? We have this kind of laissez-faire morality. You do you, I do me. And as long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other. And in essence, because we have sort of this individualistic kind of society, we really never have any social structures that are developed, right? It's why America has always struggled in developing a true culture, right? Sure, we got the NFL. Yeah, we got a turkey dinner once a year, and we got fireworks and things of that nature. Apple pie, right? They're not bad things, but they're not necessarily deep and meaningful things that bring sort of anything of a spiritual nature or a cultural nature. I mean, I think the closest you get is really the NFL, right? In fact, football kicked off this weekend. I'm a big football fan, for those of you who don't know. Big LA Rams fan. And, my wife every year tells me the same thing. When I put on week 1 of the NFL season, she says to me, Frank, I like football in the background. It's kind of like that sign that fall's right around the corner. We're going to start getting ready for the fall, Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas, all the holidays that are fun for families. And this year, though, she made a very astute observation, which is true. She goes, the other reason why I like football is because it seems like that when football is going on, it's the one time that Americans are not arguing with each other. There's sort of a national unity behind this sport. Now, many people will say, take offense to that because of some of the shenanigans politically that the NFL has pulled, and I would agree with that. But in essence, she's right. Every Sunday, we kind of get together as Americans, and it's a pseudo holiday in many ways, right? It's like I said before, the NFL even took over Sundays, which was the day of the church, the day of the Lord. In America, it's the NFL in the fall and winters that dominates on Sundays. And it is something that it brings a sort of camaraderie, right? Is that the right word? Camaraderie between fans of different teams that come together, where left and right and Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, we kind of forget that for about 7 or 8 hours on a Sunday. Now you say there's Frank, it's just a stupid game. It's a stupid sport. You're right. You're right. It is. But there's so little things that bring us together. And this is why I say the lack of a culture in America, because I would argue there was no deep, meaningful foundations within religion. There was no true religion in America, right? We played this subjective game of personal interpretation, right? The sola scriptura Protestantism that ultimately sort of fractured Protestantism even long before, right, the colonial landings of the founding of the nation. And so in that sense, America has been a nation for its prosperity and its individual rights, and for a lot of the bountiful land and gifts and resources that have been wonderful in many ways. But at the same time, America is like a body without a soul, a strong body, right? Muscularly built, in many ways, physically fit, maybe the strongest athlete, the strongest specimen of the species, but it lacks a soul, right? It lacks a soul. And I think this is what you begin to see by the 1970s and 80s. And while there's many things that Ronald Reagan did throughout that period, like take on the Soviet Union, got the economy booming, cut taxes, things of that nature, there was one key thing that Ronald Reagan, in his kind of libertarian spirit, could not solve. And that is the culture and the family, right? And really in America, no politician can solve this. And this is the Achilles heel of the entire liberal system, is that morality and religion are so subjective. that it collapses precisely because natural law, the moral law, the sacraments, the church are not in place here to properly form people in true faith and religion. We play this, again, subjective game of, personal Jesus or personal, I get to make up whatever religion I want. And I believe this is actually at the core root and the foundation, the deterioration of American society and culture, because we never had those foundations. I personally believe it was a mistake at the founding. But then again, what really could we expect from the founding when, in fact, the founding of America was a bunch of warring Protestant sects, right? They brought it over from Europe, they landed here, and they started disagreeing here right off the bat, right? Why would that change? Especially, again, when you have these subjective principles, these subjective theologies. And so we have this kind of abstract constitution, right? That is simply a document concocted so we won't tear each other apart. Well, really, those Protestant sects wouldn't tear each other apart. And how perfect that Freemasonry is mixed within the realm of the founding of America, which also preaches indifferentism to the extreme, right? That's why, in many ways, I know Protestants, a lot of them condemn Freemasonry, but in many ways, Protestants don't have the same issues with Freemasonry as Catholics do. And of course, Catholics have a long history with that, but still, nonetheless, it all worked out because many of these men that were Christians at the founding, many of the founding fathers were also Freemasons. And of course, there was no contradiction within the realm of these men's personal faith, right? And so that gives us this inherent open society. And in many ways, because America is such a vast land, big land, and people could find their own little corners for the first 150 years or so before mass transit, mass communications, nobody's really bothering you, right? You can maintain homogenous community. So if you're a Presbyterian community in, I don't know what state the Presbyterians are, let's say Virginia, for example, right? Okay, people are going to leave you alone for the most part in this country for about the first 150 years, right? Was it Maryland was Catholic for a while? Catholics went through persecution because that's what the Protestants did to Catholics. But my point is that, right, you could form these homogenous communities, maintain this for quite a while until the advancement of technologies, and then we begin to see the attack and the fracturing of every community, particularly the breaking down of homogenous community. At the same time, we begin to see the rapid growth of government, which began in the Progressive Era, sometime in that late 1800s, early 1900s period, right? This is why when we had Woodrow Wilson and his progressive vision, Teddy Roosevelt, followed by FDR during our World War II period, very radical presidents, right? That begin to take more and more power, more and more centralized control, and there's not much really that can be done about this. And now we get to really the full fruition of society in the 1980s, where now the culture is breaking down, and it's breaking down very rapidly. You see it in the music, you see it in the movies. I remember it was in 1981, 82, right around there, when we got a knock at the door, and here's this guy selling cable TV. I'm like, cable TV? My dad, my dad let him in the house and we looked at it, we're like, you get 35, 40 stations, whatever it was. And all of a sudden now, through cable TV, soft porn is in the house. Boom, just like that. Every household has soft porn, right? And about a year or two later comes the invention of the VHS tape cassettes, and all of a sudden you got hardcore porn in your home now, right? I mean, this is how fast technology is advancing, and trying to deal with this in a moral way is very difficult. And what we did as Americans, we didn't deal with this stuff morally, right? Because it's all covered under the guise of freedom and liberty. And Reagan, right, being a good old boy, kind of libertarian-esque conservative, he can't touch none of this, right? We don't have authoritarian leaders that can step in and say, okay, this is unhealthy, all right, because, and let's get rid of this. Let's make sure that our population is not ill affected by such filth and moral degeneration. We don't say that. We say, well, it's not good, it's bad, it's addictive, we really shouldn't be watching it, but in the name of freedom and liberty, there's really nothing we can do here, right? Right? That's in contrast to other societies that admittedly are not democratic, more authoritarian. We've had examples throughout history. Again, places like Italy and Spain, Catholic nations that had authoritarian leaders. When certain filth tried to be infiltrated, those leaders could stop it, right? Now, those are authoritarian governments. They offend our liberal sensibilities, but when the filthy music was going into Italy, it was banned by Mussolini. He understood the nature of the rot and how it would bring moral degeneration. I'm pretty sure Franco did the same thing. I haven't studied Franco close enough yet, but I'll get to it. But in America, we effectively have no leaders, right? We let the market determine our moral principles. And it's one of the reasons why the market is really disordered now, because markets without morality brings massive disorder, right? Nobody can tell us what to do. Conservatives tell us, well, Frank, listen, there's a difference between license and freedom. They're not the same thing. Okay, right? Because what is it that the founding fathers said? Something to the effect of the Constitution was made for moral people. And without a moral people, the Constitution eventually at some time is going to collapse, right? It's a famous quote. I forget now. Was it Jefferson? Was it Benjamin Franklin? I don't know. Okay, fine. But define to me what a moral people is. Because even the founding fathers disagreed on what morality was, right? See, these things have to be strictly defined, or they mean nothing. They're empty words, right? Maybe from an 18th century moral perspective, when you're one of the founding fathers and there's a general consensus about general morality at the time, and you can't see down the future 150 200 years down the line where everything goes batshit crazy, maybe in order to protect your warring Protestant sensibilities, okay, all right, we disagree with the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Church of England, but look how much we agree upon, right? We agree upon sex before marriage is wrong, contraception is wrong, abortion is wrong, but in time and space, without a society with strong authorities, with a moral arbiter of truth, where religion is subjective and these moral principles are attacked and they're broken down, and you reach a moral crisis, right? Who determines what's freedom and who determines what's license anymore at that point? And that's the problem we have today. You could tell me there's a difference between license and freedom, but in 2024, there's nobody to declare what is license and what is freedom. Everything is freedom all of a sudden. And this was the 1980s, right? Where I saw this firsthand in my life. Not even Ronald Reagan could stop or even alter or even slightly deter the far left, move of the culture. As, again, pornography was brought into our homes, right? You weren't going to some, they used to call it, excuse my language, your pussycat theater down in Hollywood. I was from LA. That's what they called it. It was the porn theater. You want to watch pornography, you had to go to a theater, or you had one of those, those Rolodex type films, and you watch it in somebody's basement. But most people didn't have those projector things to watch the illegal pornography. I don't know if it was illegal, but my point is, it was very scarce. And what cable TV and VHS did in the early 80s, it made it accessible, easy, fast, cheap, and everybody had it. And everybody could get it. Everybody had access to it. I mean, you got to ask yourself the question, if the filth is being brought in through economic mechanisms, right, given to us by the marketplace, who are we to decline what the market dictates? Because in this libertarian world, right, at least in this conservative classical liberal world that Ronald Reagan believed in, this was part of the advancement of society. We can all watch, Star Wars now in our living rooms. We can all watch Indiana Jones in our living room. Look at the advancement now. We can watch movies. We don't have to go to the theaters. We can watch them in the comfort of our own living room, right? And this is how it's sold. But the byproduct of that was also pornography. Could also be watched, right? Right? So you try and use some metrics of shame and blame. You try and embarrass people, right? I remember the days when I was a young man, you walk into a video store in the late 80s, early 90s, and you check out all the mainstream movies. You had all of your new releases, and you had your older movies in the middle of the store. And then there was one section with a giant curtain all around it. And that was the porn section, right? And so whenever you went behind that curtain, and of course I was a young boy, I wasn't going, but I remember the older men going behind that curtain. It was kind of an act of shame. You saw them kind of looking around to see if anybody is in the store that they recognize, so they could just pop inside behind that curtain and get the fetish that they desire out of that porn movie. I remember those days, right? But at some point, and this is my point, is somebody has to make the decision what is viable within society, what is freedom and what is license. You can try to shame it out of society, and I think shame and blame has worked in the past, but it's only worked because it had a moral force behind it. It had a moral arbiter of truth, and that was the church. That was the Catholic Church that always stood firm on these moral principles. That helped give the shame and blame sort of a collective force behind it. But in a Protestant nation like America, that was very subjective in its theology, which led to subjective moral principles, well, the shame and blame begins to die down, right? That's why when Three's Company came out in the late 90s of supposedly these, two girls and a boy living platonically in a relation, not in a relationship, but they were roommates, right? Jack and Janet and Chrissy, right? Living together out of convenience because they can't afford the rent, and so they got to share the rent. And it's a man with two girls living together. It was so controversial at the time, right? Now it's completely broken down. Now it's like a rite of passage that you got to live with somebody before you get married, right? And the old saying is right. Listen, you're not gonna buy the car unless you test drive it first, right? And so shacking up out of wedlock it's normal as the progression of morality breaking down throughout history in a Protestant society and culture without the church in place. It's unstoppable. That's why it's oftentimes by conservatives, and I think as much as I liked the Gipper, I really did. I liked Reagan in this Americana kind of sense. It doesn't work. Classical liberalism, Protestantism doesn't work at the end of the day because you need an authority. And I know as Americans, when we hear, okay, you need an authority, we cringe at the notion that somehow our individual rights might be violated because I'm an American, kiss my ass. You don't tell me what to do, right? That's the American spirit of rebellion, which goes back to the founding. And as I've always said, that I just don't think you can build a society based on rebellion. I don't think you can. And whenever I think of rebellion, I think of the fight in heaven, right? When Lucifer rebelled against God and he was cast down to the earth. It's how the fall of man kind of started, right? And that rebellion then goes into the Garden of Eden, right? Where Adam and Eve rebel. Rebellions have always been at the heart of human civilization, and generally rebellions don't work very well. I've never understood why it's such a problem to have a social structure with certain sets of moral principles applied, right? And I think it's because going back to the origins of the biblical stories, what was Satan's ultimate attitude toward God? I will not serve. I will not serve. And by the time we get to the 1980s, you had a lot of people saying, I will not serve. I will not serve. And for the progressives, the liberals, that was easy. We saw the manifestations of the I will not serve attitude and feminism and all the alternative lifestyles, things of that nature. But you also saw that on the right? This, again, this libertarian-esque attitude where nobody can tell me what to do, and freedom, 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 and you saw it. And things in the 80s got out of control. For all the gifts that we had in the 80s, the economic prosperity, the downfall of the Soviet Union, the advancements in technology, comforts became much more advanced and purposeful, and everybody was getting a hold of these technologies and these comforts. For all the good things that we had in the 80s, there was also another side of the 80s where everything broke down morally and culturally, and really the family. It wasn't done yet, the family in the 80s, but we had taken the next step. And by the time we get to the 90s, the American family is gone. I mean, what we see today with the disordered life and the transgender stuff and the LGBT stuff, these are all the offspring of those the 90s kids, right? That all came from broken and divorced homes, which came from the 1960s generation. See, that's the interesting thing about it, is that we've seen this progressive breakdown. And one of those many great things about the 80s, and I admire Reagan for what he was. And there's things politically we're going to point to how America was better back then and what a great President Reagan was. It's always selective when it comes with classical liberals, right? All of history is selective with classical liberals. Let me give you an example. When I was in the conservative movement, starting in the mid-90s, going into the late 90s, early 2000s, the talking points of the right was that America is the greatest nation in the history of the world because we spread and promote and offer freedom and liberty to the entire world. And of course, we are the most prosperous nation thanks to the capitalism and the economic engine of prosperity, and Americans live a life that our ancestors only dreamed of, right? We have more technology, more advancement, more comforts, a better way of living. Our income is higher than any other generation in the history of the world, and all of this has been done under dictates of freedom and liberty, and sort of the American mythos, or not the mythos, but the American sort of paradigm that has built the world up, become the leader of the world, and look at what America is, right? It's that shining city on a hill. It's a manifest destiny. It's the last best hope for mankind. It's the greatest nation in the history of the world. We've seen God bless America. God has blessed America in so many ways, and we're the leaders of the world. And everybody envies us because of our freedoms and because of our prosperity, right? And the lives we all live. And while there's some truth to that, I would say there's some nuances, because we were printing lots of money, we were playing with the Federal Reserve, and there's all kinds of factors there that we still see today. Shenanigans with the money supply and banking and usury and all that stuff. But nonetheless, let's just ignore that, right? What was happening on the ground by the 80s and going into the 90s and the early 2000s was lots of great prosperity, without a doubt. But here's the contradiction. Here's where history is ignored by the conservatives, right? And that is, as we're progressing through history, we get back from World War II, America now becomes the leader of the world. I would call it, it was the birth of the American empire after World War II. We have prosperity in the 40s. We have prosperity in the 50s. We have prosperity in the 60s. Then we slow down in the 70s, right? Because we got liberal governance with Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter, right? And then we get to the 80s and Reagan cuts taxes and deregulates a few things. And here comes the prosperity roaring back all through the 80s, the 90s, and really the first 2 decades of the new millennium. But you know what is also correlated with that great prosperity between, let's call it 1945 and 2024? The collapse of culture and family. It's the one thing conservatives never really address. Because the more comforts and pleasures we have had, the more we've seen the breakdown of culture and family. The family has been absolutely decimated in that same time period. And I think it's not a coincidental correlation. I think it's a direct correlation between the means which we acquire our material wealth and how we apply it to the natural world and how it affects the family. Right? Started in the 1960s. The moment the pill is made over the counter, it changes the nature of men and women. This is why it was inevitable. The moment the pill was made over the counter, men and women went from being complementary to one another, now being effectively at war against one another. Which to me, the son of, devout Catholic immigrants is odd. Men and women are supposed to be at war with each other. They're supposed to be complementary to one another. But following the pill, what comes next? I don't know the exact order of the timeline, but this pretty much all happens throughout the 60s and the early 70s, right? Divorce, easy peasy divorce is made legal. Abortion is made legal. Pornography is made legal, right? Obscenity laws are downplayed. We get the hookup culture, the shack up culture, the homosexual culture, the having children out of wedlock culture, the having children without fathers culture, right? Remember Murphy Brown in the early 90s, remember? The transgender culture, right? This rite of passage in America, which is the university lifestyle, right? Of sex, drugs, and rock and roll as a rite of passage, right? This is how you get deflowered in America, because we send our kids off to university, not only to be liberalized, right, into far leftist politics, but this rite of passage where you got to go experiment, especially sexually, right? Music becomes more provocative, more seductive. And we don't know how to stop that because, again, there's this confliction between freedom and liberty. And a lot of that stuff came really to a head in the 1980s with the punk and the hardcore rock and eventually the rap. That's all bringing adversive ideas and thoughts to the hearts and minds of the youth at that time. You want to know why we're at today with the nuttiness of the culture, the breakdown of the culture, the breakdown of the family? Why we're seeing all these adverse alternative lifestyles that have really taken shape and taken over the American society? Go no further than the 1980s. I mean, come on, you obviously got to go back to the 70s, 60s. Don't get me wrong, but my point is, with a conservative in office, one of the conservatives that is probably the most greatly revered in modern politics by classical liberals and conservatives, my point is, not even the great Ronald Reagan could stop the devolution of the culture and the family. It's America, whether it's politically or culturally or morally, is always going in one direction, and it has been from the founding. It always goes to the left if you want to use a political parallel. The question, as I always ask my friends on the right, why is that? Why aren't we able to turn this ship around? Never have been. The trajectory has never changed. Now, I know there's an argument out there by some conservatives saying, well, we're all just waiting for a religious revival to restore everything, right? God is coming to rescue us, right? Of course, as an American, I ask myself, okay, which God is coming to rescue us? Because at a federal level, God is not really ever mentioned. And the grand creator phrase that's used in the founding documents, that's clear Masonic imagery. What do Masons believe? They believe in religious indifference. They don't really name God other than the grand creator, whatever that is, right? I have an idea what I think they believe the grand creator is, but in sort of the greater American Christian culture context, we don't reveal what the grand creator is. We allow individual Americans to decide for themselves. That's why when I was in the conservative camp, obviously the creator of the universe is Jesus. Of course, that's what the founding fathers meant, right? Right? I don't know about that. Doesn't say Jesus, never mentions Jesus. Now, if you're a Federalist and, well, we have state churches. Okay, fine. We have state churches. I acknowledge that. And they're all gone now. And while the 14th Amendment might have contributed to that, I'll go to what I've always said. Why did the founding fathers put a poison pill in the Constitution? Why did they put a self-destruction button in there? And even without the 14th Amendment, as Protestantism has always broken down in every nation, every society since the Protestant revolt, what would Protestant state churches look like today? We'd be in a very similar mess. That whole 14th Amendment argument, I'm just, I get it. I understand what you guys are saying, and it's a problem. It's terrible, terrible law that has hurt the nation. I agree with you. But you're still, in regards to church and faith and religion, you're still dealing with Protestantism and all of its devolution, all of its breakdown, all of its fracturing. All those old mainline churches, they all don't mean anything anymore, right? We got new and improved. We got mega pastors and mega churches and evangelicals and independents, and it's always devolving. It's always fracturing. The theology is always evolving, and you effectively got the same problem I've been trying to highlight all night in this cast, and that is subjective morality, right? We all kind of know that certain things are wrong, but when there's no enforcement mechanism, guess what? Our fallen nature capitulates to it. And the moment we say we need an enforcer, oh, freedom, liberty, freedom, liberty. You see the mess we're in right now? And not even the great Ronald Reagan could solve this contradiction. And I do believe Reagan was a good man in his own right, in a Protestant way. He was a man of faith to a certain degree. He was a man that saw right from wrong clearly. But, well, for the most part, I think most Protestants, there comes a point where they don't see it all. They don't see the entire picture of the moral law, right? This is why, for example, contraception is one of those examples, right? Protestants just don't see it. Heck, most Catholics don't see it nowadays, never mind the Protestants. But it shows you how they don't have the complete picture or don't have the ability to see the complete picture. But in general, in a general sense, I think Reagan was a good old boy, but he was trapped also by his political philosophies, right? This kind of left and right paradigm box that I'm always referring to. And this is the trap in American politics. And it's the trap that protects all the leftist ideas from converging in on America and taking it over. I think we've reached the point where We have to think outside this box in order to make things work. And there has to be a balance and counterbalance. See, like, for example, I believe in the ideas of individual rights. I believe in certain, I believe in free speech. I believe in certain elements of freedom of the press. I believe in certain elements of even freedom of religion within a certain framework and context, right? But we get no specifications in the Constitution how these principles are supposed to be applied. These are all problems when you don't get to the root of defining what is the difference between freedom and license, right? And in America, we've never been able to differentiate between freedom and license precisely because we don't have a moral arbiter of truth. In the 80s, from what I remember, many good memories. I loved it, but the culture was deteriorating fast. I just, Reagan, the way I look at the world now from my integralist eyes, I see a man that I think meant well, but he was confined by a political ideology that was broken, and that is American conservatism. It's a broken philosophical principle, and it can't get out of its own way, because I think at the core root, it can't rectify this contradiction between freedom and license, right? And it dares not place structures and conformity in a way where we can make a fair and honest distinction between freedom and license. And this is why the culture is broken down. This is why the family is broken down. And this is why America is always headed to the far left. And you can't have conformity without true faith and true religion. You can't have that without the Catholic Church. That's the bottom line. It's the only church that goes back to the time of Christ, consistent in its faith, morality, and teachings. It didn't spring up out of thin air in the 17th or 18th century as this idea of religious license is being presented by the Enlightenment thinkers. I know I sound like a broken record. I'm always repeating lots of the same ideas, but we're also making all the same mistakes over and over and over. And growing up in the 80s, I remember lots of damage that was done to my generation because there was nobody willing to stand up to put restrictions on many of the licenses or the license that began to deteriorate the youth of that time. MTV, the porn industry, Showtime, right? I remember you could go to the newspaper stands and buy those. You put in a couple of quarters, and they were the like newspapers, but they were for sexual ads. They were for prostitutes, massages. They had nude ladies in them. This is the 80s, guys, right? And even then, any 10-year-old who had a couple of quarters on him could put a couple of quarters in the newspaper machine, and they put them right next to the newspaper machines. And you pull it up, you pull out the newspaper, got a bunch of nude women in it, right? With different ads, right? There were ads for sexual things, massages and prostitutes and escort services and stories with a bunch of nude women in newspapers. This was the 80s. It was all breaking down. There you have it. Reagan, good American boy. I liked him for what he was. Probably was the most conservative president we've ever had. Maybe the most best president we've ever had in modern times, at least. But even he was confined by a broken conservative ideology that has helped facilitate the collapse of the nation. That's where we're at. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank, signing off. Frankly speaking, good night, everybody.